Hey, my name's Alex. You know, New Year's Eve has always been a time for celebration, right? Everyone's out there with their fireworks, clinking glasses, and making resolutions that probably won't last a week. But there's this one New Year's Eve that I can't shake off, and it's been haunting me ever since. It happened a few years ago, back when I was still living in my hometown. Small place, everyone knew each other, and the biggest event of the year was the New Year's Eve party at the community center. It was like a tradition. Families would gather, and the whole town would come alive with laughter and music. Now, I was around 20 at the time, and like any other young adult, I was more excited about the party than anything else. My friends and I had plans to meet up, share a few laughs, and just enjoy the last moments of the year. Little did I know things were about to take a turn for the eerie. The community center was decked out with sparkling lights and decorations, creating this cozy yet vibrant atmosphere. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the excitement in the air was noticeable. You could feel the energy building up, the anticipation of a new beginning. But you see, there was this strange vibe that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe not. I remember standing in the crowd scanning the room for my friends, and that's when I noticed her. A woman standing by the entrance, looking lost. Dark hair, pale skin, and this distant look in her eyes. I couldn't resist the urge to go over and ask if she was okay. She mumbled something about losing her friends and not knowing anyone at the party. So, being the good Samaritan, I decided to stick with her until we could locate her friends. We weaved through the dancing crowd, searching for any familiar faces. The clock struck midnight and the cheers erupted around us. But instead of celebrating, my mind was preoccupied with finding this woman's friends. It was a weird feeling, like I was caught between the joy of the moment and an unsettling unease. As we wandered deeper into the crowd, the atmosphere seemed to shift. Laughter became hushed whispers and the music took on an eerie undertone. I remember feeling a chill down my spine, a nagging sense that something was off. The woman beside me clutched her purse, looking around nervously. And then, without warning, the lights flickered and dimmed. Panic rippled through the crowd. People exchanged uneasy glances. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of the situation. Was it just a technical glitch? Or was there something more sinister at play? In that moment, the woman I was with tightened her grip on my arm. I could sense the fear in her eyes, mirroring my own. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, time stood still. The party, the celebration, everything was shrouded in a suffocating silence. But then emergency lights flickered to life, casting an eerie glow on the bewildered faces around us. The woman I was helping suddenly froze, her gaze fixed on something in the shadows. I followed her line of sight and saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the room, cloaked in darkness. As the emergency lights revealed more details, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The figure was wearing a tattered, old-fashioned suit, its face obscured by the shadows. It just stood there, unmoving, like a specter from another time. Fear gripped the crowd, whispers of unease spreading like wildfire. People started moving towards the exits, desperate to escape whatever was unfolding. The woman and I joined the hurried retreat, glancing over our shoulders to ensure we weren't being followed. Once outside, under the cold night sky, the panic began to subside. The distant sounds of sirens echoed in the air as the emergency lights continued to flicker inside the community center. My friends found me in the chaos, and we exchanged bewildered glances. To this day, I can't explain what happened that New Year's Eve. Was it a bizarre coincidence, a technical glitch, or something more supernatural? The woman I helped vanished into the crowd, and I never saw her again. The town, once vibrant with celebration, now had an unsettling air hanging over it. I've replayed that night in my mind countless times, trying to make sense of the inexplicable. And every New Year's Eve since, I find myself haunted by the memory of that shadowy figure and the strange, unsettling energy that enveloped us. Maybe it was just a one-time event, a blip in the cosmic timeline, or maybe there are forces at play that we can't comprehend. Whatever it was, that New Year's Eve left a permanent mark on me, a chilling reminder that sometimes In the midst of celebration, we may unknowingly tread into the unknown. Back in the weave of college chaos and the uncertain steps into adulthood, let me walk you through a New Year's Eve that left an indelible chill. It was a few years ago, and my name is Jordan. The plan was simple. We'd gather at Jake's place, a modest New Year's celebration with friends, music, and the hopeful anticipation of a fresh start. The evening started as expected, with laughter and music filling the air. But as the clock neared midnight, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Amid the countdown cheers, my attention was drawn to a stranger who seemed out of place, lingering near the entrance. In the midst of the festivities, I dismissed it as someone who had wandered into the wrong party. Little did I know, that stranger would become the harbinger of a night we'd never forget. As the night wore on, people started leaving, and only a handful of us remained, winding down in the dimly lit living room. It was around 1 a.m. when the festive spirit gave way to an unsettling tension. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the apartment, piercing through the upbeat music that had played just moments before. We raced to the source of the sound, finding Emma, Jake's roommate, visibly shaken, her trembling finger pointing towards the kitchen. There, bathed in the dim glow of the refrigerator light, stood the stranger from earlier, now wielding a gleaming knife. Panic surged through us as he lunged forward, catching us off guard. In the chaos that ensued, Jake bore the brunt of the attack. The metallic taste of fear lingered as he crumpled to the floor, blood staining the tiles beneath him. The intruder, fueled by some dark intent, seized the opportunity and fled through the back door, leaving behind a scene of confusion, pain, and a chilling realization of vulnerability. We dialed 911 in a frantic panic, the wailing sirens of approaching police cars providing a shred of relief. The paramedics arrived, attending to his wounds and whisking him away to the hospital. The police combed the area, but the assailant had vanished into the night, leaving behind a cloud of uncertainty. Days turned into weeks, and the incident lingered in our minds like a malevolent ghost. Jake's physical wounds healed, but the emotional scars ran deep. The police investigation revealed that the stranger was a wanted criminal with a violent history. The randomness of the attack haunted us, a stark reminder that danger could infiltrate our lives without warning. Every New Year's Eve since then has been tinged with a somber reflection on the thin line between celebration and tragedy. The scars, both seen and unseen, serve as a constant reminder that the ordinary can quickly transform into the extraordinary, often in the most chilling of ways. It happened in the small town where I grew up, a place where everyone knew everyone else and secrets were a rarity. My name's Jamie, and I've never been one for superstitions or ghost stories. But what occurred that summer night forever changed the way I viewed the world. It was the kind of evening where the air hung heavy, and the shadows played tricks on your eyes. The town was quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves disturbing the silence. I was walking home from a friend's house, taking the shortcut through the woods that I'd traversed countless times before. As I strolled beneath the dense canopy of trees, a feeling of unease settled over me. I shook it off, attributing it to the darkness and my imagination playing games. However, as I turned a bend in the path, I saw something that made my heart race. There, standing in the middle of the trail, was a figure obscured by the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to make out who it was. It was a man, his face hidden in the darkness. I called out, but he remained silent, unmoving. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, to find another way home, but something held me in place. Fear and curiosity danced within me, locking me in a chilling limbo. The man finally spoke, his voice low and unsettling. He mentioned a debt that had to be repaid, and he pointed to a nearby house. It was old and weathered, a relic from the town's past. As he spoke, my eyes were drawn to a dim light in one of the windows. That house belonged to the Johnsons, a family that had lived there for generations. The guy disappeared into the dark, and I was left all by myself, not sure if I should believe what just happened or feel some weird fear. I couldn't help it, so I went closer to the Johnsons' house. and what I saw inside will never leave my mind. In there, I found the Johnson family looking super scared. They were all tied up, faces showing how terrified they were. Some people with masks and weapons were there, asking for something the family said they didn't have. The room got really tense and things got worse fast. In the chaos that followed, a gunshot echoed through the house, leaving one of the family members wounded. The intruders fled into the night, leaving behind a shattered family and a town gripped by fear. I called for help, but the damage was done. The Johnsons were forever changed, and the safety of our town was shattered. That night, as I walked away from the horrors I'd witnessed, the weight of the real-life nightmare pressed heavy on my shoulders. The incident was never forgotten, a stain on the town's history that couldn't be washed away. Darkness clung to the edges of Crofton, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The only break in the monotony was the annual fair, and that year, it became etched in my memory for all the wrong reasons. I remember the crisp fall air, the scent of caramel popcorn and fried dough wafting through the chilly night. It was a Saturday, and the fair was in full swing. I was with my friends, laughing and indulging in the simple pleasures of carnival games and cotton candy. But as the night wore on, a whisper circulated through the crowd, a dark undercurrent beneath the festive atmosphere. Someone had gone missing. The missing person was Lisa Turner, a sweet and quiet girl from our high school. As the news spread, a tangible unease settled over the fairgrounds. The blinking lights and cheerful music felt out of place as we realized that a shadow lurked within our seemingly serene town. I remember the search party that formed, flashlights cutting through the inky blackness as we combed the woods surrounding Crofton. The air was thick with tension, each step accompanied by an ominous rustling of leaves. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon Lisa's abandoned jacket near a rundown shed at the edge of town. The shed, hidden in the shadows, became the epicenter of our fear. We approached it cautiously, our collective breaths visible in the cold air. With a collective gulp, we pushed open the creaking door, revealing a scene that still haunts my dreams. There, in the dim light, we found Lisa. She was curled up on the floor, eyes wide with terror. The cold air seemed to suck the warmth from the room as we took in the sight of her pale, bruised face. The horror painted across her expression mirrored the fear that now gripped us all. As we helped Lisa to her feet, she whispered of a man, a stranger who had emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by darkness. He had cornered her, his intentions clear and sinister. Lisa fought, her screams muffled by the desolate night, but he overpowered her. The man vanished as quickly as he had come, leaving Lisa battered and broken. The realization that such darkness could exist in our small town left a scar on our collective consciousness. The incident cast a long shadow over Crofton, forever changing the way we looked at our quaint surroundings. The fair, once a symbol of joy, became a haunting reminder that evil could lurk where you least expect it, and to this day, the memory of that night serves as a chilling cautionary tale, a stark reminder that even in the most ordinary places, darkness can seep through the cracks. It's been years since that night, but the memories of Elmridge still haunt my dreams. I'm Maggie, and I'm sharing this because sometimes the things you least expect can turn a quiet town into a living nightmare. Elmridge had always been a place where everyone knew everyone else, a place where doors remained unlocked and folks left their keys in the ignition when they popped into the grocery store. But all that changed in the winter of 2008. The snow fell heavy that year, covering the town in a thick blanket of white. The air was still, and the only sound was the crunch of snow under your feet. It was in that eerie quietness that whispers started circulating about strange happenings in the woods. One evening, a group of us decided to investigate. Curiosity got the better of us, and we trudged through knee-deep snow, guided by the fading light of the day. The woods felt different, as if the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something. We stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin, its windows boarded up and the door hanging from one hinge. Something drew us inside despite the biting cold that seeped through the cracks. The air was stale, like it hadn't been breathed in years. As we explored, we found a small room in the back. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn hastily in what looked like blood. The air thickened with a sense of unease. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl from the darkness. Panic set in as we fumbled for our flashlights, scanning the shadows. And then it emerged. A creature, hunched and twisted, with eyes that gleamed like coals in the dark. It moved with an unnatural grace, its movements sending shivers down our spines. We ran, but the woods seemed to close in around us. Branches grabbed at our clothes, and the snow beneath our feet became an obstacle, slowing us down. That's when it struck, slashing through the darkness, leaving one of us screaming in pain. We didn't look back until we reached the edge of the woods. The creature, whatever it was, remained hidden in the shadows. We carried our injured friend back to town, but Elmridge was never the same. The incident was hushed up, labeled as a wild animal attack, but those who were there knew the truth. Elmridge had a secret, one that lurked in the depths of the woods, waiting for the curious souls who dared to venture too close. Never again can I bring myself to go into the woods. The events that transpired a few weeks ago caused this. Here is my story. I was never a big fan of rural areas, being born and raised into city life. But when my lifelong best friend Cody mentioned a big camping trip that he had been adamantly planning, I couldn't say no. Considering that he was my boss in the office and had given me the week off for the trip, there was no way I was getting out of it. The thoughts of sleeping in a tent surrounded by spiders and centipedes and God knows what else were enough to unnerve me. But after seeing his face light up like a little kid as he detailed his plans, I couldn't bring myself to let him down. He set us up on a 5-day hiking camping expedition through the woods a few miles outside of town. The woods intersected with our state's reservation for the Native Americans, and being 1/4 Mohawk himself, Cody genuinely wanted to check out some of the scenery that was included around the hiking area. Despite my initial hesitation, it did seem somewhat interesting, and I agreed to go with him on his little trip. Poor judgment on my part. A few weeks go by, and I found myself walking through the woods with Cody with 60 pounds of gear on my back, covered in sweat and mud, and wondering what the fuck I was doing. We had stumbled into the reservation early on the second day of our trip, and it was almost as if the woodland itself had a different aura to it, a pure feeling of some kind that we both noticed. But no matter how clean the nature felt around us, I was still disgusted by all the different insects and thorny plants that I continuously had to flick off from my clothing. After battling a horde of house cat-sized mosquitoes that was assaulting me, I asked Cody, "When are we going to set up camp?" Not to be a bitch, but my legs are getting a little tired. He consulted his map and pointed over the next hill. "There's an old Mohawk burial ground over that ridge, and I thought it'd be cool to make camp there for the night," said Cody. Afraid to belittle his culture in some way, I reluctantly agreed. When we got to the burial grounds, it just appeared as about a dozen raised stone and grass mounds in a small clearing. Nothing special to say the least. We pitched a tent in the tree line around the grounds, so as not to disrespect the dead, Cody said. We unpacked and cooked some food. After eating dinner and discussing our company's upcoming financial merger, Cody grew tired and fell asleep. I powered up my phone and went to make my daily rounds of all the social networking sites, my last attachment to the city life that I had kept during our time in the woods. Under the large trees, I was getting no service, but as I walked towards the burial mounds, I was able to pick up a signal. As I was waiting for my emails to load up, the water I had with dinner started to catch up to me. Not wanting to urinate in open view of the tent, I ducked around one of the mounds to relieve myself. Finally, my emails loaded, and I saw that absolutely nothing interesting had happened back home in the past 24 hours. Feeling satisfied I hadn't missed anything, I started walking back to the tent to get some rest. When I reached the tent and went to undo the zippered door, I could feel the hair on the back of my neck prick up. That ominous feeling that something was watching me hit, and I was instantly aware of how loud my heartbeat had gotten. I turned my flashlight around slowly, and my beams caught a deer in the brush about 20 feet behind me. He was a pretty large buck, with a large set of antlers, one of which was broken, and an ear that seemed to have been bitten off at some point. When I saw it was just a deer, my heartbeat returned to normal and relieved. I entered the tent to get some much-needed shut-eye. The next day we trudged onward through the reservation lands. As much as I hated the woods, I had to admit that the foliage was beautiful, and I'm sure any amateur photographer would have been kept busy in this setting. It wasn't until dusk that I noticed something was off. All the bird chirping and forest noises that we had heard all day had completely disappeared. I assumed that the forest went to sleep as soon as the sun started to go down, but Cody seemed a little uneasy about the silence too. Regardless, we had to set up camp, so he went to find firewood while I pitched the tent. Usually it will take me 2 to 3 tries to get the tent set up correctly. That night was especially difficult because once again, I had the eerie feeling I was being watched. I wheeled around and once again see the face of a deer. The deer with the broken antler and the damaged ear peering out of the bushes looking at me. Involuntary shudders crept throughout my body, and I got the all-around sense that something wasn't right. When I made movements to try to shoo the deer away, he simply stayed put and stared at me with those beady black eyes. In this case, though, logic overcame my gut instinct, and I realized that the deer posed no serious risk to me, so I shrugged it off and continued setting the tent. When Cody returned with firewood, I told him about the encounter. His lower jaw dropped and his face instantly put on a look of utter fear. He hurried me into the tent, closed the door, and started telling me a story about the Aqueonque, or deer men, that the Mohawks had legends about. They appeared as tall, dark, skinny men, yet could take the form of deer and other animals of the forest when need be. He described them as demons of the forest, who preyed upon unwanted visitors and invaders to the Mohawk lands. He started explaining legends of how some of the original American colonists were gruesomely murdered after clearing Mohawk forests to make their homes in the New World. At this point, my hands were shaking uncontrollably before Cody had to stop his story mid-sentence from a sudden fit of laughter. He looked at me and said, "Come on, man. I know you're afraid of the woods and all, but forest demons? Don't tell me you believe that shit." I punched his arm and called him an asshole and had no choice but to laugh at myself. Regardless, that night my dreams were plagued by shape-changing deer and wolves and bears who were waiting in the woods to murder me in some brutally violent way. These paranoid thoughts carried over into the next day's hike, where every sound that I heard was something stalking us, waiting for an easy chance to go in for the kill. Unfortunately for me, Cody didn't notice how much his story had thrown me off, and so I still had the task of collecting firewood that night as we set up camp. I took the flashlight and set out before it got too dark. As I was about 10 minutes away from our camp, my flashlight ran across a deer's face sticking out from the foliage about 30 feet ahead of me. Sure enough, he had a broken antler and a ruined ear, so it was the same one I had seen before. His beady, almost dead eyes just stared at me like they had the 2 nights before. Except this time, I noticed that something was really wrong with the whole picture. Then it hit me. The deer's head was almost 8 feet off the ground, and something was definitely fucking wrong. My hands started trembling as I panned the flashlight down from the deer's face. And between the leaves I saw what looked to be a long, slender black arm with sharp claws pointed directly at me. I dropped the flashlight, turned, and sprinted towards the tent as fast as I'd ever run before in my entire life. Not looking behind me, I reached the camp and pushed Cody inside the tent. In my hysterics, I wasn't able to relay the full story to him, but he caught onto my fear immediately. We grabbed our camping knives, the only weapons we had brought, and sat in the tent that night looking out the windows, vigilant for anything that would try to approach our camp. When dawn finally came, we were both still awake. By that point, he had gotten the full story, and after consulting a map, decided that we could make it to a local road and call for a ride back home before nightfall. Leaving all the non-essential items behind, we trekked for the road, called a cab, and got a ride back to the lot where our cars were parked. Cody still didn't entirely believe that what I witnessed was true, but I knew what I had seen. "Go home, get some rest, and we'll meet for drinks tomorrow," he said. I silently nodded my agreement as he dropped me off at my house and pulled off into the night. Feeling relieved to finally be back in the city, I jogged up the stairs to the door, unlocked it, and walked into the apartment. As I set down my keys and walked to the bedroom for some well-needed rest, I noticed an odd irony tinge hanging out in the air. The smell was weak, but certainly there. I turned on the bedroom light, and it was just sitting there on my bed staring back at me, with its ruined ear and broken antler. The next day, the police told me the deer had been skinned, and some sort of a mask had been made of its face and left in my bedroom. No additional evidence of a break-in was found, and it was never determined how the perpetrators had gotten into my locked apartment. The police investigators tried passing it off as simply another random act of vandalism by some of the meth heads that frequented the area. According to the investigators, the weirdest part was that nothing was taken from the apartment at all. In fact, the only additional clues left behind were the 4 long gash marks that had been cut straight across my bed. This happened a few years ago. My aunt and uncle own a restaurant. One Saturday, they were moving from their old location to the new one. My aunt, uncle, future husband, boyfriend at the time, cousin, and about 10 other people, mostly employees, were helping with the move since there was a bunch of large equipment. We were all at the old restaurant packing things, tying them down when we ran out of ratchet straps. I offered to drive to my parents' house, about a 30 minutes drive, to get more straps from my dad. Because everyone else was busy, I went alone. On the way back, I got a call from my aunt saying that they were all going to take a load to the new location and to meet them there. Since I didn't know how to get to the new place, I pulled over in a park to put in the address. From the road, you aren't able to see the parking lot at all because of the trees. The only odd thing that I didn't notice at the time was on this sunny weekend day, there were no other cars in the parking lot. I pulled into a parking spot and immediately grabbed my phone to put in the address. For whatever reason, I didn't put it in park like I normally do, which unlocks the doors. Less than a minute after I looked down, I heard and felt a huge hit to the car. I remember looking at him for so long I thought it was odd how I couldn't see the color of his eyes because of how big his pupils were. It's important to note that I was in a small SUV, and he had to bend over to look in the window. A second later, he was pulling the door handle so hard I thought it was going to come off. I was also confused why the door wasn't unlocked, like it normally would be when I'm in a parking spot. He got visibly upset that the door wasn't opening, so he started banging the side of his fist against the window, swinging his whole arm over and over. Getting progressively more pissed, he moved to the door handle of the back seat. And at this point, I was so scared of him getting in the car, I grabbed and unsheathed the camping knife I had in my door. When I looked back at him, he stopped attacking the car, saw the knife, and smiled. I think it was right then I realized that he didn't want money. He didn't want to rape me. He wanted to kill me. I knew that if he got in the car, it was going to be over for me, even with the knife. He was way bigger than me, and hitting the car so hard I was amazed that the windows held. I guess I got comfortable with him not being able to get the doors open, but after bashing the back window a few more times, the car rocking back and forth every time he moved to the trunk, the panic got worse because I knew the doors weren't opening for some reason, but maybe the trunk would. Since it was an SUV, if he got in the trunk, he could just climb over the back seats and get to me. He hit against the back window with both of his balled-up fists and was yelling something I couldn't understand. Right then, I realized that I could slam it in reverse. I dropped the knife in my lap, hit my gear shift into R, grabbed the wheel, and put my foot down. I still have no idea if I hit him or if he jumped out of the way. I didn't look back. I put it in drive and peeled out of the parking lot. It was my first time ever ignoring a stop sign. I still have no idea why I didn't put it in park. It was a regular Tuesday night. My parents were away and I had the house to myself. I was chilling on the couch, binge-watching a series, when I noticed something odd outside my living room window. The street was dimly lit, but I could make out a figure lurking near my neighbor's house. At first, I thought it might be one of their friends or a family member, someone they were expecting. But the longer I watched, the more uneasy I became. This person was just standing there, staring at their front door. It gave me the creeps, but being the rational person I am, I dismissed it as my imagination running wild. As the night progressed, I got up to grab a snack from the kitchen. That's when I heard a creak, a subtle noise that sent a chill down my spine. I froze. The front door was slightly ajar. Panic set in, and I immediately regretted not double-checking if I'd locked it. I hesitated, debating whether to investigate or call the police. But curiosity got the better of me, and against my better judgment, I tiptoed toward the door. It swung open with a soft groan, revealing an eerily quiet house. I heard a noise upstairs like footsteps. My heart pounded as I realized someone was inside my home. Fear gripped me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I retreated to a closet, my breath caught in my throat, praying they wouldn't find me. From my hiding spot, I could hear the intruder moving through the rooms, searching for something. The tension was unbearable. I clutched my phone, ready to call for help, when I heard a noise from downstairs. It was a door slamming shut. I strained to listen, and my blood ran cold as I heard the unmistakable sound of a scream echoing through the night. My mind raced, and I realized the intruder hadn't found me, but had moved on to my neighbor's house. Guilt and relief washed over me in equal measure. I couldn't believe the horrifying turn of events. I stayed hidden until I was sure it was safe, and then, with shaky hands, I called the police. When they arrived, I explained what had happened. The reality hit me like a ton of bricks when they went next door. My neighbor, a kind elderly couple, had been brutally attacked. The scene was something out of a nightmare. It wasn't a random break-in. The intruder had specifically targeted them. The investigation unfolded, and the police caught the perpetrator. Turns out he had a twisted motive and had mistaken my house for theirs. It's a chilling realization that I narrowly escaped a fate that befell my neighbors. The guilt still lingers, wondering if there was anything I could have done differently. The randomness of it all, the fact that a simple twist of fate saved my life that night, is a haunting thought. It's a reminder that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places, and sometimes survival is just a matter of luck. So there you have it, the night I narrowly avoided a killer but couldn't prevent the tragedy that unfolded next door. Life can be stranger and scarier than any horror movie. Stay safe, everyone. The coffee shop was like my safe haven, a comfy place tucked between tall office buildings and the busy city life. It was where I went to relax after a tough day at work, getting away from all the noise of tasks and duties. I really enjoyed being by myself, savoring the peaceful times with a hot cup of coffee and a great book. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the deserted streets, I returned home after a particularly taxing day at the office. The air was crisp, and a sense of tranquility hung in the atmosphere. Unlocking the door to my apartment, I noticed an unfamiliar chill. It felt colder than usual. I lived alone, no roommates and no family to interrupt my peaceful routine. As I made my way through the rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence was oppressive, echoing in the empty space like a haunting melody. I instinctively reached for the thermostat, but it was set to a reasonable temperature. Puzzled, I decided to shake off the unease and retire to my room. As I settled into the routine of changing into comfortable clothes, I noticed my normally lively cat, Whiskers, was nowhere to be found. Concern etched my face as I searched every nook and cranny. After a brief but tense search, I discovered him cowering behind the living room couch. His eyes were wide with fear, and he hissed at my approach, a behavior entirely foreign to our 3 years of companionship. Trying not to let the unease settle in, I left him to his refuge, assuming he'd come around once whatever had spooked him had dissipated. Little did I know, it was just the beginning of a bizarre night. As I prepared for bed, the serenity of the night shattered when a muffled voice outside my window broke through the silence. It was a man, repeatedly calling out a polite but eerie, "Good night." Fear gripped me as I peered through the curtains, only to see the dim outline of a tall figure dressed in a dark suit. His unsettlingly long smile and unnaturally white teeth were visible even in the dim light. The man seemed fixated on me, waving with disproportionately large hands, his words repeating in a monotonous loop. Questions raced through my mind. Who was he? And why was he lurking outside my window in the dead of night? Panic set in as I fumbled to dial 911, but just as quickly as it began, the unsettling goodnight ceased. A sudden, thunderous noise filled the air, the sound of someone racing up the stairs. My heart pounded as I heard my cat growling and hissing in terror. The night descended into a nightmare as bone-chilling sounds filled the air. The man's distorted voice whispered through the door, sending shivers down my spine. I pleaded for an explanation, but his response was a hauntingly casual, "Good night." The banging on the door intensified and I retreated to the window, paralyzed by fear. Eventually, the disturbance subsided, leaving me curled up by the window until the first rays of morning light. Trembling, I cautiously opened the door to find Whiskers, unharmed, and waiting for me. Relief washed over me as I held him close, grateful that the nightmare had ended. To this day, the events of that night remain a chilling memory, a surreal encounter that defied explanation. It's a story I've kept to myself, afraid that sharing it would lead to skepticism or judgment. Yet, the echoes of that bizarre night linger, a reminder that even in the most ordinary moments, the line between reality and the inexplicable can blur in unsettling ways. It's Valentine's Day and I'm just chilling at home. No fancy plans, just a quiet night alone with my thoughts and some pizza. Suddenly, I hear a knock on my front door. I'm thinking, who could be knocking on my door at this hour? I cautiously get up and peek through the peephole, and there's this person standing there, wearing a red hoodie with the hood pulled up real low. I couldn't see their face, but they're just standing there, not moving, not saying anything. My heart starts racing, and I'm like, what the heck do they want? I decide to crack the door open just a tiny bit, and I ask, "Can I help you?" The person doesn't answer, just keeps standing there. It's cold outside, and they don't even look like they're shivering. I'm getting weirded out at this point, and I'm like, "You got the wrong house or something?" Still no response. They're just staring at me with these empty eyes, and I can feel this weird energy in the air, like something ain't right. I'm about to slam the door shut when they finally speak, but it's in this low, whispery voice that sends shivers down my spine. They say, "I need to come inside." I ain't no fool, so I slam the door shut and lock it. My heart's pounding and I'm thinking this is some kind of sick Valentine's Day prank. But then, I hear them start knocking again, louder and more insistent this time. It's like they're trying to break the door down. I grab my phone and dial 911, telling them there's someone outside my house and I'm scared for my life. The operator tells me to stay on the line, and the cops are on their way. I'm just standing there, watching the door shake from the force of this person banging on it. Finally, the banging stops and it's dead quiet outside. I'm thinking maybe they gave up and left, but I ain't taking any chances. I stay on the line with the operator, and a few minutes later, I see the flashing lights of the police car pulling up to my house. The officers come to my door and I let them in. I tell them everything that happened and they go outside to check things out. I can hear them talking on their radios, and they tell me there's no sign of anyone around. No footprints in the snow, no trace of the person in the red hoodie. But then one of the officers notices something strange. The back door leading to my backyard is wide open. My heart sinks and I tell them I didn't leave it like that. They cautiously enter my backyard, guns drawn, and I'm sweating bullets at this point. They search the backyard and I'm praying they don't find anyone. But then, they come back and tell me they found a trail of rose petals leading from the backyard door to my bedroom. My bedroom, where I had been just moments before all this started. They carefully search the house, but there's no one inside. My heart is pounding like a jackhammer and I can't believe someone was in my house while I was on the phone with the police. The officers say they'll keep an eye on the area and advise me to stay with a friend or family member for the night. As I'm packing a bag, I hear the officers talking on their radios. They're saying they found the red hoodie tossed in a nearby dumpster. The person had apparently changed clothes and vanished into the night. I leave my house, never finding out who that person was or what they wanted. It's been years, but I still can't forget that night, and I always lock my doors tight on February 14th. So if you ever hear a strange knock on your door on Valentine's Day, don't open it. No matter what, you never know who or what might be on the other side, and they might just find another way in. It was Valentine's Day, the kind of day you'd expect to be filled with cheesy gifts and reservations at fancy restaurants. Me and my girlfriend, let's call her Sarah to keep things simple, decided to do something different. We planned a road trip to a little-known trail outside our town, thinking a hike would be a perfect way to spend the day together, away from all the cliché. The weather was on our side, chilly but not too cold, with a clear sky. The trail was more secluded than we anticipated, with hardly any signs of other hikers. It was exciting in a way, feeling like we had the whole world to ourselves. We joked about the usual stuff, our future, the funny-shaped rocks, and the possibility of getting lost. Neither of us was worried. We had our phones, GPS, and it was still early. As we delved deeper into the forest, I noticed Sarah's mood change. She became quieter, her pace slowed, and she kept looking over her shoulder. I asked if everything was okay, and she brushed it off, saying she felt a bit off but didn't want to ruin the day. We decided to take a break, thinking food and rest might help. That's when things got weird. We heard a noise, not the usual forest sounds, but something off, like whispers, almost too quiet to catch. Sarah tensed up, her eyes wide. I tried to laugh it off, suggesting it was probably just other hikers or an animal. But deep down I felt uneasy too. The forest seemed too quiet, the air too still. We agreed to head back, realizing the day was slipping away and neither of us wanted to be out here after dark. But as we turned to leave, we couldn't find the path. Panic set in. We were sure we hadn't strayed off, yet everything around us looked unfamiliar. Our phones somehow had no signal and the GPS was glitching, showing us moving in circles. Hours passed and the light began to fade. Sarah was on the verge of tears and I was doing my best to stay calm, but fear was gnawing at me. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared. An old man dressed in clothes that seemed decades out of place, standing silently before us. He didn't speak, only gestured for us to follow him. Desperation overrode our hesitation. We followed him as he led us through the thickening trees until, miraculously, we emerged onto the familiar path, just a stone's throw from our car. Turning to thank him, we found he had vanished without a trace. We drove home in silence, the weight of our experience sinking in. We never spoke of it to anyone, fearing they'd think we were crazy. But something changed between us after that day. A shared look would sometimes pass, an unspoken acknowledgement of the fear we'd faced and the inexplicable help we'd received. Who was the old man? How did we lose our way so completely? And how, in our moment of greatest need, did help appear so mysteriously? I gotta tell you about the scariest Valentine's Day experience of my life. It all happened at the movies, and I can't believe I made it out alive. So grab your popcorn, and let me take you through this nightmare. It was February 14th. My girlfriend Emma and I decided to go see a movie to celebrate. We picked this new thriller that just came out. We were both excited and dressed up for the occasion, hoping for a romantic night. We got to the theater early, thinking we'd have our pick of the best seats. But when we entered, something felt off right away. The place was practically empty, except for this one guy sitting in the very back row. He was alone and seemed to be watching us as we walked in. We brushed it off as maybe he was just lonely on Valentine's Day. We chose seats in the middle, trying not to pay any attention to that guy. The movie started, and everything was going fine until I noticed that the guy in the back row was staring at us more intensely. I mean, who goes to a movie just to watch other people? As the movie went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't enjoy the film. I whispered to Emma, "Hey, that guy's giving me the creeps. Let's move." So we changed seats, thinking we'd shake off the weirdo. But as soon as we settled in, I saw him again, now sitting a few rows behind us, still watching. I was getting seriously freaked out by this point. Emma was starting to get scared too. We decided to leave the theater and complain to the staff about this guy. But as we got up to go, he stood up too, and that's when I noticed he was holding something in his hand. It looked like a knife. We hurried down the aisle, panic taking over. We reached the exit, but it was locked and the lights in the hallway were flickering. We turned back to face the guy, and he was slowly walking towards us, that wicked grin on his face. I swear I've never been more terrified in my life. We darted into a side door, hoping to find help or a way out, but it just led us to a dark, creepy hallway. It was like something out of a horror movie. We could hear his footsteps getting closer, and we had no choice but to keep running. We finally found an emergency exit, and as we burst outside, we saw a security guard patrolling the area. We ran up to him and told him everything. He called the police, and they arrested the guy inside the theater. Turns out he had a history of stalking and was carrying a weapon. I still get chills thinking about that night. It was supposed to be a romantic Valentine's Day, but it turned into a real-life horror story. I'm just glad we made it out of there in one piece. February 29th. The day that Middlefield changed forever. You probably haven't heard of Middlefield, Oregon because it doesn't exist anymore. It does exist anymore because of him. And that all started on February 29th, 1988, with the disappearance of Carol Grott. It was raining the day that Carol Grott disappeared. She was 15, 2 years younger than me. Middlefield was pretty small, a few thousand people, and no records of it now. But back then, before Carol went missing, it was a pretty calm little town. Situated near the border of Idaho and Oregon, it's one of those farm towns where everyone knows everyone, and nothing ever happens. At least nothing ever happened until February 29th, all those years ago. That day, all of us walked to school, just like any other day. The school was a plain building, 6 stories with a track and a football field that also served for soccer. Not that we really had many sports, there were only 400 students from kindergarten up. It was impossible not to know everyone, and even more impossible to not know everyone's business. Carol never showed up. The teachers called her parents, who were concerned but not too concerned. It wasn't unheard of for kids to occasionally play hooky or to sneak off somewhere with someone of the opposite, most of the time sex. Of course, word got around then. We all knew she wasn't there, and it was most of what we talked about on the walk home. I thought she'd be grounded for a few days. Freddie, my younger brother, said he bet her parents would make her help when their cow birthed its next calf. Even after all these years, I never got over the disgusting nature of helping birth a calf. That night, we ate dinner, did our homework, and went to sleep. I remember that my dad was still in the living room, the news blaring into my bedroom. My door was open just the slightest bit, and I fell asleep with the picture dancing over my ceiling. Next morning, I woke up to my mother shaking me. "Laura," she said softly, her hand on my shoulder. "Laura, baby, wake up. Wake up." Birds were chirping. The sun was streaming in through my window. The rain had stopped. I remember groaning, turning over in bed. "I don't want to go to school," I said, like I said every day. "There's no school today," my mom told me. "Get up, Laura, the police are here." I feel so guilty now for what I was thinking. I remember thinking they'd caught wind of me and Jeremy cow-tipping a few weekends ago. They knew about the empty beer bottles we'd buried in the Smith's backyard. They were aware that Charlotte McDonald was no longer a virgin, and she'd been pregnant and had tried to give herself an abortion by throwing herself down the barn stairs. I got up and changed out of my nightgown, sleep still clinging to the corners of my eyes as I came outside. True to my mother's word, there were 3 cops sitting at the living room table. Sheriff Williams was there, smack dab in the middle, and that's how I knew I'd fucked up big time. But of course it was about Carol Grott. And again, I can't forgive myself for ever being relieved that I wasn't in trouble. "Laura, have you heard from Carol lately? Any word that maybe she wasn't happy at home?" I looked from one of my parents to the other. They gave me blank stares in return. Carol and I weren't very close, but no, I didn't hear anything. "Well, we know you and the Jenks boy are close." They're words for dating. His sister is quite close with Carol, and so we wondered if maybe when you were around the Jenks place you'd ever heard anything, eavesdropped, been privy to any information. I shook my head. My father was sitting in his chair at the end of the table, a coffee mug between his 2 palms. His hair was still brown back then. I remember his face, the solemnness of it, like he knew what was coming. The wrinkles between his eyebrows were just starting, the flesh on his cheeks just beginning to sag. He was already preparing for it. He just didn't know it back then. "Sheriff Williams, is Carol in trouble?" The sheriff looked from me to his officers to my parents. "Carol never came home last night. Have you ever felt your blood turn to ice in your veins? Like the feeling of getting caught in a really big lie, when your face grows hot and your stomach feels like pure acid driving against your insides, eating away at you? The kind of panic that manifests in shaking and shivering, trembling. It was like the whole world was filled with water. Everyone was sitting at the table still and somber and grounded, and I was just trying to find which way was up. That's when I started hyperventilating. I don't know why it bothered me so much. Like I'd told the sheriff, I didn't know Carol very well. Yes, she was Jeremy's sister's friend, but that's a lot of removal. She was 2 years younger than me. Different class at school. I only knew her as the girl with the long yellow curls, the blue eyes, the cotton dresses she was partial to. I remember those cotton dresses because she was wearing one in the missing poster. They went up that same day, March 1st, all over town. Carol looking down at us, smiling like she'd never been taken. As for all of us, school was canceled for quite some time. It was canceled for a week because all the teachers were in the search party, and half of the seniors and juniors too. We searched the woods, the fields, neighboring areas. We drove all the way down to Twin Cities and all the way to Salem. We called the highway patrol of 5 different states: Nevada, California, Oregon, Idaho, Washington. None of it mattered, because she showed up on a Tuesday. At least, her body showed up on a Tuesday. It was found on the side of the highway leading out of town, right there on the side of the road, laid out with an orchid sitting on her forehead. The rumor was, and all I got were rumors, because the adults were worried that we couldn't handle the truth, at least for Carol, at least not until more started disappearing. The rumor was that she'd been found with her eyes wide open, staring at the sky, blue marbles. The orchid had been arranged so that the long tendrils of roots were planted into her ears and nose and mouth. The stems leading up out of her body, flowers pointed to the sky. She'd been dressed in white, the rumors went. A white dress laid out on the side of the road, dead. There were other whispered rumors. Things like sexual assault and rape were whispered quite a bit. Apparently the ME had thrown up when he looked beneath that white dress. He said it was the bruises and what was done to her down there. It was noted also that Carol was missing a foot. As for the official cause of death, we didn't know. The ME had no idea, said there was no sign of strangulation, stabbing, asphyxiation. He said of all things, Carol, 15-year-old Carol, had had a heart attack. Post-mortem, the orchid had been planted inside of her. Indeed, her brain had been scooped out, severed at the optic nerves. Her skull had been turned into nothing but a pot. But why she had died, the exact method of his killings, I wish I still didn't know. The truth is, I do know. I know exactly what he did to his victims. I know because I was his last, and I know how Carol died. Because I was there when Freddie died. He took us. He kept us. I'm the only one who got out alive. We weren't allowed to watch the news for some time after Carol's body was found. There were pictures that showed what had been done to her head. But rumors flew rampant at school back then, and we all knew how the orchid had found its place inside of her. The back of her head, a long, slim incision made at the base of her skull, another at the base of her jaw. The skin had been peeled up. The tendrils of orchid roots had been snuck inside her nose and ears. Some surgery had been done on the plant too. It had apparently died within days of Carol's body being found. The worst rumors said that the surgeon had carefully planted the orchid within her skull after her death. There were rumors about how she'd died, spontaneous heart attack, injected with a drug that couldn't show up on the screenings, psychologically tortured, raped. The list went on. The worst rumors said that the surgeon had carefully planted the orchid before her death. How that was possible, I didn't know. It made me sick to think of it. It made my stomach turn, the acid and bile scrubbing against my insides until I had to excuse myself. That's what I did frequently those days. Carol hadn't been my friend, but I could still see her. I could see her in the hallways, smiling as she opened her locker. And when I vomited, the bile rushing up out of my stomach and into whatever vehicle I had managed to reach, the image of her pain and suffering almost transferred to me. I knew what she was feeling. I thought I knew. Middlefield was under curfew. We had to be home before dark, and it was suggested against leaving the house before first light. Of course, most of the farmers didn't listen to this. They had to be out and about before the sun came up. But there was no problem. Middlefield had a small police force, but they were pulling all-nighters patrolling the town. More volunteers signed up. City police came down from Eugene to help. There were even some fancy detectives who walked around in ties and carried their badges on their belts, right next to their guns. One night, 3 weeks after Carol's body had been discovered, I heard a noise outside the house. My room was on the second floor. My brother and I shared a wall with our parents' bedroom down a small hallway and separated by a bathroom. Freddie and I both had windows that pointed outside to the street, though his window was partially obscured by the branches of an old oak that grew on our property. I thought at first the noise was a patrol. It sounded like rustling, someone going through our garbage. Then I thought that maybe it was raccoons there looking for food. The rustling was loud, a clanging of glass on tin and footsteps. I swear I could hear grunts. I could hear someone making an effort, really going through their paces. My heart was pounding. Trying to be quiet, I grasped around in my nightstand for the flashlight, rolling out of bed and going to the window. There were more grunts and crashes, and then a quiet curse. My heart skipped a beat, the blood in my veins turning to ice as I slowly pushed the window up and held out the flashlight. Turn it on, I thought to myself. It's just a policeman. It's nothing. It's Dad trying to do some late-night work. He threw out something he didn't mean to. I took a deep, shuddering breath, still holding the flashlight aloft but unlit. I set out into the night. Hello? The rustling stopped. There was the snap of a twig, the sound of footsteps. Hello? I said again, more loudly. Dad? Sheriff Williams? There was silence on the other end. I waited, my heart pounding. I was scared to turn on the flashlight. I didn't know what I would see if I did. I held my breath and clicked on the flashlight, sweeping it over the yard. There was a scuffling near the base of the house by the trunk of the oak tree. I hitched the window up more, leaning out of it and sweeping the light over the grass. But there was no one there. Slowly, I clicked the flashlight off and closed the window. I latched it, staring outside at the road for a long time. I half expected someone to come out of the dark or yell, "Boo!" But there was no one there. No one came. I went back to bed. I dreamed of rustling noises, of orchids, of screeching laughter. The next morning, our neighbors, the McDonalds, found a severed foot on their porch. Their daughter, Charlotte, had been taken from her bed. But she wasn't the only one. My boyfriend, Jeremy, was gone too. Before Carol Grott, there weren't any murders in Middlefield's history. Sure, sometimes cowhands got into fights when they'd had one too many beers at the bar, and that ended with Sheriff Williams carting them off to the one-cell jailhouse so they could work some stuff out. But there was never really any serious crime. Cow tipping, underage drinking, and sex were part of growing up. Of course, just because there aren't murders don't mean there aren't deaths. The old church down the road from the Jenks place joked that they hosted as many wakes as they did sermons, since Sunday morning was a day to sleep in after a hard week's work. Mr. Tom White doubled as a pastor in the county veterinarian, specializing in equine births or something of the like, so he was often tired too, and more than happy to hold off a sermon in return for another few hours of sleep. Life didn't take a break in Middlefield is what I'm saying. Babies were occasionally born, old folks died. There were tragedies on occasion as well. 10 years before I was born, a boy belonging to the Millers had drowned when he went up to Lake Owyhee on his own. His body had never been found. When I was 5, a young boy hung himself in his parents' barn, for reasons my dad would never speak of. There were rumors, of course, but nothing ever came of them. Similarly, just 2 years before Carol Grott disappeared, one of my friends had died going into labor. She was 20 and married, so no scandal there. But it was sad to say the least. The thing about the surgeon is he never really gave us time to have peace. He wasn't, of course, officially a serial killer until Jeremy and Charlotte's bodies turned up, but that wasn't until June. In the meantime, I'd turned 18. The search never really wound down. We were always on the edges of our seats just waiting for the two to turn up. The detectives, two white 30-somethings who had driven down all the way from Portland, seemed at a loss. The extra police from Eugene would get in their cars to drive home only to come back again, claiming they couldn't bear it if another kid was taken and they had just given up. But we were all losing hope toward the end of May. School was back in session and finished. Freddie had a summer vacation and I had the rest of my life. Of course, I hadn't applied to college. My family didn't have the money, and what good would it do me to have a college education if I was just going to work on a farm my whole life? Once upon a time, Jeremy and I had talked about getting married and moving to Bend or Eugene or Salem, starting up our own family or a little farm or maybe even a bookstore or a restaurant. We didn't have any set-in-stone goals, we only wanted something exciting and new. June 5th, 1988 was the day of my graduation ceremony from high school. I got to put on the cap and gown with my small class of seniors, and we were to sit on fold-out chairs on the football field in the blazing sun while Mayor Radcliffe gave some speech about education, and then we'd all go home and have barbecue or else play a friendly game of soccer or football, and the next day some of us were planning to truck up to Lake Owyhee and go swimming. But those things never happened, I'm sure you could guess, because June 5th was the day that Jeremy came back into my life. I was the one who found Jeremy. I think it must have been planned that way. I think during his imprisonment with the surgeon, Jeremy must have talked all about Middlefield, maybe even all about me. I found Jeremy from my bedroom window, looking out at the road and watching the dawn on the day that I was supposed to get my diploma. I knew what it was before I even really knew what it was. That doesn't make sense, I know. But I ran down the stairs and out into the front yard without thinking about it, and there he was. His hair had been trimmed and he didn't have a beard. His eyes, brown and empty and staring up at the lightening sky, obscured only by the large purple petals of the orchid that had been planted on his face. His mouth was opened wide, and the long tentacle roots had been somehow planted through his nose and were emerging again through his mouth, snaking their way down his chin. It looked like he was vomiting roots, his mouth hinged open with those green, snake-like veins coming out. Stem and leaves and even a bit of root was coming from his nose, reaching to the sky. I was sick, of course, I can't remember much but that image. Someone must have found me because I heard screaming. I leaned down and tried to put him in my arms. He was dressed in white, a white shirt that had been starched so stiff it felt like cardboard under my hands, and white slacks and white shoes. All white. As I held him, the screaming got louder, like there were more people joining, and I heard my dad calling my name, and then he was yelling too. There were lights, blue and red, flashing, screaming, screaming, screaming. It hurt my ears, it hurt my head. And it was only when Sheriff Williams squatted down beside me and put his hand on my shoulder that I realized the screaming was coming from me. That's all I remember. What I've heard since is that my dad carried me up the stairs and put me in my bed, and the doctor came around and gave me a sedative. I slept for almost a week straight on drugs, dreaming of nothing and remembering nothing, and coming around only to learn from Freddie that Charlotte's body had turned up too, and that Tom White Jr. and Olivia Frank and Sandy Green had been taken, and there had been a foot on the Franks' porch, and also on the Whites' porch but not the Greens, and that the detectives figured the surgeon was trying to figure out how much damage he could do and how many he could take all at once. I stopped going out. I just wanted to stay in bed. The doctor came, and Freddie came and sat by my bed, and even a specialist from Eugene came to talk to me about trauma and grief. There were different pills to take, and most of them make those next few weeks before the latest 3 turned up fuzzy. That's how I learned the details then, in a state of half-consciousness. So I hope you'll forgive me if I don't get them all right. The ME had found that Jeremy's death was as inexplicable as Carol's. Charlotte's death, though, had been by strangulation. There was nothing forensically left on the body that would have been useful. Apparently there had been some hope when seminal fluid had been found on Charlotte. But then the DNA matched for Jeremy. Both of them had bruises and scars and lacerations beneath their white clothing. Jeremy, post-mortem, had been castrated. Charlotte had been found with an orchid, just as Jeremy had. I didn't want to hear anymore. I wanted to block out the world. Freddie was my only source of sanity in that time. He used to get in bed with me and hold me while I cried for hours. He hauled up the old TV and VCR and took Dad's car and drove all the way to Boise and back, 4 hours round trip, to get brand new movies and cold cheeseburgers that we could heat up and eat. It was comforting, even though the buns were chewy and the fries were soggy. It was comforting to the extent that anything can be comforting when you see how your boyfriend has been murdered and turned into a pot for a plant. It was the middle of July when the 3 latest bodies turned up. I was still in bed, though I'd been taking small walks in the afternoon. Freddie had even convinced me to get on a horse one day, and I'd gripped the reins until my knuckles went white while Freddie spoke soothingly to the mare so she wouldn't buck. Then after about 10 minutes I got off, and Freddie took my hand and we walked back home, and I got back into bed. The morning after I'd gotten back on the horse, the bodies turned up. I'll spare you the details except to tell you it was more of the same. Orchids, rape, and torture. One body with no identifiable cause of death, while the other 2 had been strangled. The ME guessed they'd all been killed at the same time, all kept for a day or 2 before their bodies were planted back at home. None of the funerals had taken place. All of the bodies were being kept in cold refrigeration units until the investigators decided there was nothing else of use. Of course, it wasn't those 2 detectives from Portland anymore. They'd been replaced by feds in black SUVs. People were leaving by then. In some cases, leaving was making them go broke. Several families I knew had just picked up and left in the middle of the night, spooked, saying they were going to stay with family in Eugene or Bend or Boise. Others sold off all their farm animals and tried to move ship and sell their land. No one wanted to buy, not in a town where children kept going missing, so they ended up losing most of what they had but got to keep their children. In the 2 weeks between the end of July and when the surgeon took his next victims in August, the town became a shell of itself. I woke up from a nightmare on August 10th, 1988. In it, I'd been making love to Jeremy when suddenly roots sprouted from his mouth and ears and nose, and he started gurgling and choking and then fell dead on top of me. Even though I was screaming, the roots took hold of me, winding their way into my ears and nose and mouth, forcing their way down my throat. I woke up gasping. I hate to say it, I do. I hate what I'm about to tell you because I think it makes me a terrible person. But part of me wishes I hadn't woken up that night. Part of me wishes I'd taken some drugs to go back to sleep. Then I never would have had to go through it. But I did. I didn't sleep through it. I did wake up and hear the rustling outside the window again, just like the night before Jeremy went missing. I did reach into my nightstand with my heart pounding and grasp my flashlight. I did go to the window. I did see a figure. 2 figures. A black vehicle of some sort. There was a figure, tall and large and shadowy, dragging another across the grass of my front yard. It was Freddie. I knew it was Freddie. And without even thinking, without even doing anything remotely smart like you'd think I'd have done, I ran down the stairs without my shoes and out onto the front porch. I ran into something strange and soft and cold, and across the grass toward the figure. And I started yelling at that point, telling him to get away from my brother. The lights went on in my house, I think, because the shadows got worse. I was on him then. He hit me hard across the face, then in the stomach. He picked me up like a rag doll and threw me in the back of a box truck. The metal sheet was rolled down, and the world was black. I felt around with my hands, desperately reaching around for something to use to get out. But the only thing my fingers found were 2 sets of legs. I could hear yelling outside. There was banging on the back of the door, and I was screaming for my mom, my dad, for help. Then we were moving. It was pitch black in the back, and all I could do was feel around on my hands and knees. There were 2 other bodies back there, and one at a time I felt until I could identify their chests, and pressed my ear to them, listening for a heartbeat. I kicked against the side of the vehicle where the driver would be. I slammed my fists on the metal. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was another dream as we drove further and further away. I screamed until my throat went numb, even though I knew it wouldn't do any good. I banged on the metal. I tried to open the back hitch. Finally, the car slowed. I started to cry. I knew I was going to die. I knew Freddie was going to die. Whoever else was in that trunk with us was going to die. And we were all going to die after something truly horrible was done to us. Then we would be dressed in white and orchids would be planted in our skulls and we would be deposited back at home. We were going to die. The hitch slid open. I lunged, scraping and kicking and screaming for all it was worth. I got a hand to the throat, a quick dart that sent me breathless and gasping for air. There was a hissing sound, and the sound of metal tumbling in the back of the van. I'd lost my voice and my air. I was going to die. I was going to die. I was going to die. It hurt. The gas. I looked for new air but couldn't. The air I gulped down was anything but pure and clean. It burned the inside of my throat, my nose, my eyes. I tried to scream but couldn't. I choked, sucked in more air to try and compensate, choked. The world got fuzzy. My stomach contracted and I vomited. I felt my thigh wet and thought I'd peed myself. I coughed, sucked up air, choked. I could feel myself suffocating, could feel my brain trying to get oxygen. That's all I remember until I woke up in the surgeon's room. When I woke up, I was on a bed. The room was bright and white. Floodlights, that's what they call them. There were floodlights glaring down at us, so that when I closed my eyes, there was still this red fire. My entire body hurt. My lungs burned, and when I coughed, it sounded like it does when you have a cold that lingers far too long. My eyes hurt, stung, felt too dry. The exact feeling is hard to describe. Like every part of my body had been dried out. I would have done anything for some water. Freddie was on a bed too. It was bright, but there's always a degree to which your eyes adjust. I remember lifting my head up to look at him, but my head throbbed so badly I had to put it back down. I turned my head enough to see that his chest was rising and falling. That was enough for that moment. The other room was taken up by a girl. Her face was turned away from me, but I thought I recognized her hair. I'll just tell you, her name was Madeline Davis. She was my friend. I don't know how much time I spent on that cot when I first woke up. I remember turning over, trying to get my bearings, shoving my head into the pillow to try and block out the light. Eventually, Freddie and Madeline came too as well. But we were in cells made of something. Plastic, I think. We could put our hands up against the plastic, but we couldn't touch each other. Against the wall, out of our reach, were 3 orchids with long, hanging roots. A reminder of what would happen to us eventually. I can't tell you how many hours I spent in that bed at first wondering who had been there before me. I wondered if Jeremy had been on my cot. I was afraid, yes. I was terrified of what would happen, but I also still ached for him. Part of me, a really fucked up and small part, wanted to see him again. I wondered what would happen when I died. The surgeon kept us there for what I think was an eternity before we saw him. There was no food and no water. I passed the time by turning on my side and counting as high as I could before I lost track. The floodlights never turned off. My eyes ached for sleep, but every time I felt myself drifting, a loud, high-pitched siren sounded that threatened to burst my eardrums. All 3 of us would scream, covering our ears from the noise until it abated. By that time, we had been yanked from sleep. And so it went. Finally, we saw him. I wish I could say that the surgeon was gruesome or terrible, but he looked like any other adult. He had glasses and wore slacks, held his hands behind his back when he walked. He had a cruel half-smile that was always on his face as he tortured me. He was in his 30s, maybe 40s, a grown man. The first time we saw him, he offered us bottles of water. He slid them through little slots in the plastic cells. I drank mine greedily. He left us, he didn't say a word. And so it began. The floodlights were so bright, so incredibly bright that I almost didn't notice when the drug started to change them. They tightened into thin streams of light staring down at me. Then they turned to fire, burning my skin. Holding up my hands, I could see the flesh melting off, and I began to scream. The floor of my cell was covered in the roots of orchids, and they reached for me with long, waggling fingers. The very air itself was deadly. I could see that it had been changed from air to poison, and the few shadows that weren't eliminated by the floodlights turned to demons that watched me with piercing eyes. I tried to look for Freddy. In the cell over, he was curled up on his side with his knees to his chest. I watched as his flesh ate at itself. His clothes and skin were dying before my eyes, curling into black ash and dribbling down on his bed. Madeline's hair was made of snakes, their eyes staring at me as they opened their mouth to hiss. But my own hair was made of snakes too. I pulled at it, tried to yank it out. I scratched at my skin until blood ran from it. I screamed until my throat went numb. This was the schedule. We were not allowed to sleep. The surgeon would enter, give us drugged water, and leave. We were caught then between being drugged or going thirsty. My head hurt constantly. A corner of my cell, humiliating, horrible, I know, turned into my toilet. I pissed the bed when I was on the drugs. Eventually, I had sores along my legs. Watching Freddy and Madeline scream was almost worse than taking the drugs myself. There were times, after the effects had abated, that I thought of not drinking the water and letting myself die of thirst. I didn't know how long it would take. I knew it wouldn't be pleasant. I didn't notice when the surgeon came for Madeline the first time, or when he came for Freddy. I was in the middle of a hallucination about the floodlights, those terrible fucking lights. I wanted to sleep. I wanted to cry. My entire body hurt. On the drugs, I could feel parts of myself that had no nerves. My hair hurt, my nails hurt, my eyelashes hurt. Every part of me on fire, itching, sweaty, smelly. He came for me eventually. It was always while we were on drugs. Eventually, we just went with him. It was better than being punched and kicked and dragged through our own shit to get there. He would take us into a separate room and strap us to a table. There would be bands on our heads, our wrists, our ankles. That's where he would rape me, if he so saw fit. He would ask us questions about Middlefield and our parents and our friends. He never told us his name or anything about him, but he said that it was the town's fault that this was happening to us. I won't tell you everything he did to me because it would take too long and be far too exhausting. I can tell you that he tortured us. He had tools, an entire array of them that he would spread out on a table before approaching us. He said he'd like to watch us scream. I don't know how much time passed. We were rarely allowed to sleep, and the drugs kept us confused. Sometimes it seemed like years went by. Other times it felt like it had barely been a second between one visit to that table and the next. I remember my last time. I was crying. I was so tired. I was in so much pain. He told me it would be over soon. The human body could only take so much, he said. He would always tell us what he was going to do to us. I'm going to collapse your lung now, he would tell me. It will be uncomfortable. You will feel like you can't breathe. He was always right, too. He asked me about Jeremy. He asked me about how we had sex and what it was like. He asked me about the town. He broke my finger when I didn't talk. Drugs, torture, seeing the orchids on the wall. It formed a new time, a new era. In what I have to think was the day before Freddy died, the surgeon gave us a rare respite. We were all on our cots with the floodlights on. I mouthed the words to Bob Dylan songs to Freddy through the plastic barrier. Our full water bottles sat on the floor near our beds. It was a brief moment of lucidity. Freddy was crying. On the other side of me, Madeline had curled up and hugged her knees to her chest. None of us had been able to speak to each other since we had been taken. None of us had felt the touch of another person on us. None of us were allowed to sleep. Freddy died first. He was there, and then he just wasn't. The surgeon took him, and when he brought Freddy back, Freddy was dead. The surgeon dumped him on the floor of the plastic cell, in the midst of Freddy's own waste. My brother's head was turned toward me, and his eyes were open. I was almost glad because it meant that he wasn't going to suffer anymore. None of us were going to suffer anymore. It was time. I'd given up by then. I didn't care. It was going to hurt. It was going to be unbearable. It was going to be torture. At one point, I had refused to drink the drugged water he gave us. In return, the surgeon had drugged my food. The living nightmares returned. I drank the water. What was the point of trying to resist? He strangled Madeline in front of me, but he didn't strangle me. Instead, he picked up both the bodies, Madeline and my brother, and dumped them in my cell. I cradled Freddie's head in my lap. I ran my fingers through his hair. No more water came, no more food. The surgeon did not come and collect me to torture me after that. I was alone. They tell me it was 3 days. 3 days that I sat with my dead brother's head in my lap, cradling him and rocking back and forth, unable to sleep. Soon we'll all be together, I would whisper to him. I sang songs to him. There were no drugs, but still sometimes I would look down at him and see his skin melting from his face. I would see his jaw turn into a gaping hole before my eyes. When I blinked, it was over. What I'm told is that because of the commotion I made, they were able to see the kind of car the surgeon drove. They found clues, the G-men in their black SUVs and tinted shades. The surgeon went out after killing Freddie and Madeline and dumping them in my cell, got cornered and had killed himself rather than given himself up. But they found me. I don't remember what it was like being found. There are many memories, fragmented and smashed to bits. Did I think they were angels? Did I think I was dead? It's hard to say now. I stopped talking. For 6 months, they put me in a special hospital and I didn't talk. I developed severe agoraphobia. I would hide under my bed, clutching my knees to my chest and shaking. I had incessant nightmares where I would wake up clawing at the air, screaming, thrashing. Naturally, there were no orchids in that wing of the hospital. The police tried to question me. They wanted to know everything that had happened to me, every sordid detail. I would tell them, eventually, but not then. I had to be sedated again. I was told that I went far away. My parents thought that whatever the surgeon had done to me, it had ripped the soul right out of me. His name was Jonathan Miller. He was 46. When he was 18, 10 years before I was born, his mother had found the remains of animals he had killed as a child buried in their yard. His father, William Miller, had driven him up to Lake Oahe under the guise of a graduation present, knocked him unconscious and thrown him in the lake to drown. Then they'd claimed he went up by himself, that it had been an accident. The town had mourned Jonathan Miller and then moved on. The doctors told me this while I was still mute, staring at the ceiling of the hospital room. The Millers had been arrested. I didn't go to Freddie's funeral. I didn't go to any of them. Eventually, I spoke again. I drank water without fear. I took a step outside, and then another. I let my father hug me. My parents sold the farm. Everyone did. No one wanted to live in that town anymore. The government came through and bought all the land and turned it into some sort of factory. We moved to California, the warm part. My room had blackout curtains, so that whenever the light became too much, I could close them and experience the dark. I never got over it, I guess you could say. I healed. The scars on my body disgusted me less and less. I met a man who lets me sleep with a gun in the nightstand drawer and who holds me when I wake up screaming. I wish I could say something else came from it. I wish I could say Freddie's death meant something. 8 children died at the hands of Jonathan Miller. It destroyed my life. I can't tell you the number of times I've thought about killing myself, but the thing that keeps me from doing it is Freddie. I got to live and he didn't. He died. Madeline died. I sat with their dead bodies for 3 days before they found me. So I stay alive for Freddie, because he didn't get a choice. For better or for worse, I do. It started as most things do, with my boredom. I was surfing around on YouTube looking for funny videos or scary videos when I stumbled across something that caught my interest. It was run by a user who went by The Meat Man, and it involved stop-motion footage using some very disturbing puppets. The thing that honestly caught my eye first was the thumbnail. It was a figure that appeared to be crafted entirely out of ground meat. I remember seeing the model and lifting an eyebrow as I took in what I was seeing. Now, when I tell you that the models were grotesque, I don't mean that they were ugly or badly made. They were very well put together, and the amount of detail that had gone into them was astonishing. These meat puppets had hair and clothes and facial features that had all been meticulously crafted to the point of being a little uncanny. I would have almost expected them to blink or move on their own, and they seemed too lifelike for the medium. The episode I had found was episode 5, and as I watched it, I quickly began to realize that this was no normal bit of YouTube content. Episode 5 involved 3 characters, Lisa, Steve, and Michael, as they prepared for the arrival of a 4th character, Dawn. The background music was jangly and discordant, somewhere between a calliope and a merry-go-round, and it often made the voices hard to hear. The characters were cleaning up the house, which was mostly a sheet of paper, with windows drawn near the ceiling and some furniture crafted from modeling clay. As they cleaned, a voice told us how Lisa was being lazy and expecting Michael and Steve to do the majority of the work. I remembered thinking this was odd because her character moved and dusted and tidied at least as much as the others, and they seemed to be working well together. After a few minutes of herky-jerky cleaning, a hand came down from the ceiling and congratulated Steve and Michael on a job well done. It then pointed a pudgy finger at Lisa and scolded her for being so lazy. The voice said that Lisa would not be allowed to join the party later, since she hadn't helped. As Michael and Steve walked off stage, Lisa's character curled into a ball as loud party music played in the background. I remember feeling bad as the last frame sat frozen in place, the camera zooming in on the prostrate Lisa as she sat hunkered against a wall. Though I couldn't hear anything over the loud party music, I could see the small figure shaking a little and thought she might be crying. What the hell was this? And why did it suddenly make me feel almost voyeuristic for watching the suffering of this lumpy knot person? After that, my morbid curiosity was hooked. I went to the attached channel and saw that he had about 10 videos up, all added within the last month or 2. His channel was small, only about 80 subscribers, and they were all in that style of stop motion where he used the figure's grotesqueness to his advantage. I found the first episode, Friendship, and decided to watch it. The video was about Lisa, the meat puppet from before, and how she was sad and lonely all by herself. The puppet mostly sat in the same familiar position, bent over and appearing to sob. Suddenly, 2 other familiar puppets, Steve and Michael, came into the scene, and Lisa looked up and seemed happy to see them. The pudgy hand, whom she called Father, said he had seen that she was lonely and had gotten her some friends so she wouldn't cry so much. The hand stroked her delicate hair, and it seemed to be much nicer to her now than it had been in the previous episode I'd watched. The 3 hugged and said they would be friends forever. Then the episode ended and the screen went black. It had lasted less than 5 minutes all told, but it still made me feel strange and put off. Those puppets were so odd-looking, and I just couldn't shake the feeling that there was something not right about them. I was also hooked and immediately loaded up the second video. It was like a train wreck, and I needed to see how it came out no matter what the carnage looked like. The next 2 episodes were pretty similar to what I had come to expect. They were called Cohabitation and Family, and followed the lives of Lisa and her new roommates. They set up some furniture, and had some getting-to-know-you chatter, as wonky music played in the background, making their words hard to hear sometimes. It was the typical stop-motion fare, but there were odd refrains sometimes in the middle of the stop-motion. During one in particular, the boys, Steve and Michael, were talking with Lisa about what to make for dinner. The stop-motion abruptly cut, and you could see 5 or 6 seconds of the models just standing as a loud sobbing came from the background. Amidst that sobbing, there was a soft but angry voice trying to quiet the crying. I had to rewind it a few times in order to catch it, and I remember wondering if this was some sort of artistic film or something. Was the artist trying to make some kind of point or something? Maybe he was trying to hide it amidst the stop motion to make it even more avant-garde? It wasn't until the 4th episode that things got bad for Lisa. I noticed that while the first 3 videos had come out one a day, the 4th video had taken almost a week to come out. This wouldn't have been strange for any other channel, but the total shift from episode 3 to episode 4 was alarming. The video was about 5 minutes long and seemed to entail Lisa going out on her own one night and getting lost. She had gone out for a walk, despite being told not to by the father hand, and had gotten herself lost in a forest that had been drawn on white paper. The trees were the big swampy kind you often saw on kids' art assignments, and it was clear that Father Hand was no artist. He wasn't a consistent narrator either, because his voice and his tone seemed to get angrier the longer the episode went on. The condition of the puppet looked ghastly, and that only added to the surreal horror of the show. The Lisa puppet was clearly in bad shape, and halfway through the show, a piece fell off of her and landed on the table. The narration ended abruptly as the music continued over the visual of the graying puppet just standing in place. The sound of someone stomping off was audible over the jangly discord, and the steps sounded heavy and angry. There was a brief moment where the sound of someone begging to be let go, but it cut away just as the sound of screaming started. The video was edited badly, and an attempt had clearly been made to cut it out. When the show resumed, the Lisa puppet was completed again with what appeared to be a fresh hunk of meat attached. The piece that had fallen off, however, still laid on the table as though it was no more useful than a snakeskin now. Towards the end of the episode, the Lisa puppet bent over and seemed to weep as she was alone and scared in the forest. This weeping was overlaid by a soft and frantic weeping in the background, though I'm not sure we were meant to hear that part. All of a sudden, the father hand came and showed her the way home. It scolded her for running away and told her she must never do that again. Much like an actual father, the hand seemed relieved as well as angry, and Lisa went with him to the house meekly enough. When they returned, the Steve and Michael puppet did not seem happy to see her. They shunned her silently, and the episode ended with Lisa crying in a corner somewhere. Then the episode faded to black, and the credits rolled. I hovered my mouse over episode 6, not sure if I really wanted to watch it. Episode 4, called Thankless, made episode 5 make a lot more sense now. Father Hand was still likely punishing Lisa for running away, though the start of the episode made it very clear that she had just been going on a walk. The episodes were easy enough to follow, but something in them still made me uneasy. Why were these characters living under this fatherly hand character? Why did the narrator call them roommates if Father Hand treated some of them like children? The whole show just had an odd surrealist nature to it, and there seemed to be an underlying story that I just wasn't getting. I was invested, though, and had to see how it came out. Episode 6 was the strangest by far, and the comments on the video seemed to prove that I wasn't just going crazy. It was called Melancholy, and the episode started with the same weird dance music and a shot of Lisa hunched up and crying. The crying, however, was not the canned sound it had been before. The episode was 3.5 minutes of someone sobbing heartbreakingly, the kind of sobs that are equal parts hopelessness and terror. The camera seemed to be slowly panning in on the intricate face of the meat puppet as the sobs in the background went on and on. I had seen some strange videos in my time, but this one definitely took the cake. The final shot was of the eye of the meat puppet, clearly defined and lovingly traced. You could see the meat beginning to mold, see the bright splotches that decorated the surface, and just before the screen faded to black, you could hear the elevated terror in the voice of the person sobbing before it was shut off by the end of the episode. I had to take a break after that one, reading the comments as I tried to make sense of what I had just watched. The Meat Man's audience seemed to be a little divided on whether this was an artistic expression or something much darker. A user had said that the sobbing and screaming had been unique, and that he couldn't find them on any of the usual free use sites. Another user questioned whether they were too real or not, thinking this might be part of someone's torture fantasy, but others seemed to think it was just some avant-garde piece that was a little too pompous for its own good. What they did agree on was that even if it was acting, the screams were a little too real, and that all of them felt some sort of way about those cries of anguish. I had hoped that maybe episode 7 would be a return to sanity. But episode 7, called Jealousy, was just as weird. The narrator was telling us that the Dawn character was adjusting very nicely to the house. All the tenants loved her. They all wanted to be her friend, and indeed, the father Hand, Steve, and Michael were all standing around her and moving animatedly. Only one character, Lisa, didn't seem to want to be friends with Dawn. She seemed to be in another room, still hunkered up and crying. The narrator explained that Lisa was jealous of Dawn and that Father was becoming cross with her attitude. The sobs from the previous episode were gone, but there were some other low noises barely discernible over the loud, jangling music. The puppets seemed to be in much better condition as well, and I suppose they had changed the meat on them recently. The father Hand came and yelled at Lisa some more, but she just stayed hunkered up and crying. Finally, he left, and the episode ended as the camera zoomed in on the little meat woman, hunkered in her anguish. I looked at the next episode and wondered if I really wanted to see more. It felt like I had been watching for hours, but it turned out that all 7 episodes had taken less than 30 minutes. Something about watching the byplay between the characters had gripped me, and I felt that I needed to finish it. At the same time, there was something much darker here than I had expected. This was like someone's confession. The whole thing felt very intimate, and I felt almost voyeuristic for watching. I clicked the next episode, though, telling myself that another 3 episodes wouldn't do too much damage. How wrong I was. Episode 8, called Hatred, opened with Lisa leaning against a paper wall as the others tried to get into her room. They started out nicely asking her to come out, wanting to talk and wanting to see her. The narrator told us that Lisa had been shirking her chores and saying unkind things to Father Hand about the other roommates. Father Hand, of course, had shared these things with the others, and now they wanted to talk with her. As their knocks became pounds, all 3 of them pulling up on the paper door as they banged and kicked. Lisa pulled her hands to her ears and put her head between her knees. The narrator told us how Michael and Steve wanted to talk with her, and how Dawn was really upset that Lisa would judge her so hastily. As they pounded and banged on the paper door, Father Hand suddenly came into the scene. Lisa looked up from her knees and seemed unsure of what to make of the sudden appearance of the fatherly phalange. Father Hand told her that she had brought discord to the house and that he could no longer ignore her insolence. The hand turned itself into a fist and began to beat the puppet savagely. Chunks of meat fell off and were squashed beneath the pounding. The wire body was twisted and warped, and the whole scene was made all the more horrific by the overlying carnival tune that scratched like razors across my brain. It ended as Steve and Michael knocked, and the camera zoomed in on the sad pile of meat that Lisa had become. The episode ended abruptly, and when I saw a pale figure staring back at me from the suddenly dark screen, it took me half a second to realize the pale and sweating figure was me. Episode 9, Contrition, was next, and there was no question on whether I would watch it or not. I needed to know what came next. Episode 9 was as different from the others as night and day. It was a shaky cam of someone walking through woods by night. A butter yellow light provided a small patch of illumination, and whoever was recording was breathing heavily as they trudged through the woods. The woods were supernaturally silent as they went, and the leaves crunching underfoot were loud and jarring. The video was 4 minutes long, and 3.5 minutes were nothing but walking feet, crunching leaves, and heavy breathing. Then abruptly they stopped before a small round stone. The ground before it freshly turned up and put to rest sloppily. "Sleep well, Lisa," came the phlegmy voice of the cameraman. Then it all went black again. I hit the 10th episode before I could think about it, wanting to see how it ended. Episode 10, Ambivalence, seemed to be a return to normal. Dawn was sitting on the couch, seeming to laugh at something on a TV out of view. Michael and Steve seemed to be milling about, cleaning or just chatting. The wall that had marked Lisa's room was nowhere to be seen. The father Hand looked over them, benevolently, as the narrator told us about Michael looking for a book he had misplaced, and Dawn watching her favorite show. All seemed well, all seemed normal. Other than the broken corpse of Lisa that laid on the floor. The damage that Father Hand had done still lay about the ground, and the meat was brown and dry. Flies had begun to circle the meat body, and if one of the puppets had to go near her, They seemed to walk unheading over her body. The only character who seemed to notice her was the father hand. He would look down at her from time to time, almost smugly, and shake his head before looking back at the other happy puppets. Episode 10 went dark, and I was yet again left wondering what I had just seen. The video had managed to move into my head rent-free in less time than it would have taken to watch a movie. I had moved on to other videos, other activities, but the images were never far from my mind. I'd been known to suggest strange videos to friends of mine, even linking them on Reddit to certain groups. This one, however, was not one of them. I was hesitant to talk about it, let alone tell people about it. I did not want others to suffer under this like I was, and that was probably why I was thinking about it when I saw the poster. I was traveling for work. I work as an expert witness for specific cases, and I do a lot of traveling and a lot of waiting, which often leads to the aforementioned boredom. I was driving through Michigan when the call of nature became too much to ignore. Luckily, there was a rest stop up ahead, and I was zipping up and heading out of the restroom when I saw the missing persons wall. My eyes found the woman before I could stop myself, and my breath caught in my throat as I came up short. The woman's name was Elizabeth Rainey, 23, and she had been missing for the last 4 months. The poster was new, unmarred by yellowing and creasing, and I pulled it easily from the bulletin board. Looking at her face, I realized how much work must have gone into each puppet. Her nose, her wide forehead, the small dimple in her chin, the dent in her left cheek from some childhood accident. They were all there, and they had all been lovingly added onto the porous face of the meat puppet. I took the poster back to my car, my check-in time approaching quickly, and called a friend of mine who worked at my local police department. I told him about the girl, about the YouTube channel, about the videos, and he said he'd look into it without much enthusiasm. When he called me later that day to thank me for the information, he sounded much more interested in what I had to say. I called him again a few weeks later and offered to buy him drinks if he'd sate my curiosity. He was willing, but said I might not want to know as bad as I thought I did. Over drinks, he told me the whole sad story. My friend had a friend too. His friend was an agent with the FBI, and after watching the videos, my friend had told his friend. He sent him a link to the channel and asked him to take a look. After watching the drama himself, he had tracked the IP and decided to see what they could find about this guy. Turned out that Elizabeth wasn't the only familiar face that was missing in the Michigan area. Michael Chavez, Stephen Choate, and Don Lee were also missing from the same area. The IP address was coming from an old house near Lake Huron. The owner, David Matthews, owned the house and quite a lot of acreage out there. When they had raided his house, they had caught David by surprise and found more than they bargained for. He had been keeping them in his basement. The sick bastard had a large finished basement with 4 separate rooms. The central room held a couch, a TV, and a large kitchen table with a small set for the show and a camera. The puppets were on a shelf nearby, their bodies gray and sagging off their clothes hanger. The other implement in the room was a large, rusty meat grinder. A meat grinder with strands of rotting meat hanging from the spout. He said the flies had been thick in the room and the sounds of moans had not begun until they started kicking down doors. Dawn, Michael, and Steve were lying in their respective rooms. Most of them, anyway. He had said, taking a long pull from his beer. He sent me the photos of the crime scene. I wish to God he hadn't. David had been in the room that had likely once belonged to Elizabeth. He had been wearing her dress. The fabric badly stretched around his frame and was sobbing in the corner. No matter what the agent said to him, his response was always the same. His rocking making a strange grinding noise as his butt slid over the concrete. He said, "I shouldn't have played God, I shouldn't have made her sleep." Just kept saying it again and again and again. The others didn't say much of anything, my friend had told me. He had scooped them to the bone, cutting off fingers and toes and arms and legs so he could grind them up to make their puppets. He'd used tourniquets and animal tranquilizers to keep them alive. Michael and Steve were little more than torsos, Steve having half a leg and Michael little more than an elbow. Dawn was missing her legs, but her arms were thankfully intact. She had only been in the basement for a month, and it seemed like he hadn't had as much time to take from her. They had gotten all of them out of there, and David Matthews, the meat man, was now in custody. A real win for the good guys. My friend had said, his stare 1,000 miles long, though none of them will ever walk again. The men are in a catatonic state, and the girl only spoke gibberish, but at least we saved them before he could finish his sick play. They had yet to find Lisa's body, but he told me they hadn't given up yet. As I sit here, going over the facts as I write, it all just runs through my head like a rat in a maze. Every moan, every sob. Was this sicko harvesting his victims so he could replace the flesh of his precious puppets? I was an unwilling participant in this, watching and encouraging this sick bastard to continue. I want to forget it, but I can't. I may never forget what I saw in that short hour of my life. I may never forget the terrible knowledge that the meat man has invested in me, and I may find my curiosity sated for quite some time. This all happened back when I was in college, around 6 years ago. I was a junior at a big state university, just trying to get my degree and enjoy the whole college experience before having to become a real adult with a career and responsibilities and all that. My friends and I lived off campus in a pretty run-down rental house close to the bars and parties. It was kind of a shithole, but it was cheap and let us be as loud and reckless as we wanted without any RAs telling us to keep it down. One weekend in early October, a bunch of my buddies and I decided to throw a big rager at our place to kick off the Halloween season. We spent a couple days prepping, by stockpiling cases of Natty Light and Keystone and all the other cheap, shitty beers college kids love. We also made sure to mix up several of those plastic tub punch concoctions, where you just toss in random sodas, juices, and bottom-shelf liquors together. The final product always tasted like gasoline, but it got you plastered on a budget, so we didn't care. By 10 p.m. on the night of the party, people had already started flooding in and the crowd was building quickly. We literally just put the word out on social media, texted friends, hit up group chats, and left it as an open invitation for anybody to show up. My buddies and I weren't exactly selective or concerned about putting any limits on the guest list. The more people that showed up, the better the party, at least in our minds at the time. Around midnight, you could barely even move through the house without shoving your way through the sweaty, drunken mess of people. Every room was crammed full of rowdy students. Drinks were being spilled everywhere. The air was thick with smoke. Music was thumping at ridiculously loud volumes from the speakers we had set up. Empty cups, bottles, and crushed beer cans were strewn about every surface. Just your standard, out-of-control, huge college house party scene, really. At some point that night, maybe around 1 a.m., I was drunkenly bobbing and weaving my way from the living room towards the bathroom, trying my best not to spill my drink or run face first into anyone. That's when I noticed this one dude standing off by himself in the crowded room. He just looked weird, out of place, and sketchy as hell. He was tall and gaunt with longish greasy hair, beady eyes, and a permanent scowl on his face. Dressed in old, ill-fitting clothes, like he literally found that outfit buried in a dumpster and put it on. The whole getup made him look vaguely homeless, but also vaguely threatening, like he wouldn't be out of place on a wanted poster or mugshot. No idea who this guy was or how he even ended up at our rager. Sure, my friends and I cast a wide net when spreading the word about the party, but there's no way any of us actually knew this dude and invited his creepy ass. To this day, I have no clue how he found his way into our house and into the crowd that night. As I was squeezing past him in that narrow hallway, I accidentally made eye contact. In that brief moment, the guy just stared right through me with the hardest, most chilling death stare I've ever seen, like he was seconds away from just completely losing it and going totally ballistic right there in that instant. Those dead, soulless eyes were almost daring me to look away first. I tried to just write it off as a drunk people being drunk and moved on, but I couldn't shake how deeply unsettled and creeped out I felt after that. There was just something evil about that guy's whole vibe and demeanor. Yeah, I know that sounds stupid and melodramatic as hell, but in that moment it honestly felt like I had just witnessed a disturbing glimpse into the eyes of true, raw evil or something along those lines. gave me the heaviest case of unexplainable bad vibes I've ever experienced. Maybe an hour or so later, I was out on the back patio catching a breather and trying to escape the sweatbox heat and smell of the house. A small group of buddies were out there with me, doing the same. That's when we suddenly heard a bunch of commotion and shouting coming from the front of the house. At first, your typical drunken idiot is always shouting about something stupid at parties like that. So we didn't think much of it initially. But then someone came rushing out back, shouting at the top of their lungs, "Call 911, someone's been stabbed." My drunk brain honestly could not even begin to process that at first. Stabbed? At our own supposedly chill kickback? As in, with an actual knife and blood and everything? By who? As my friends and I started making our way around to the front of the house again, the scene that unfolded was complete pandemonium. Security guards from the campus PD or somewhere were trying to get people to stop crowding and clear out of the house. People were screaming and freaking the hell out everywhere you looked. And there, lying in a pool of blood on our dingy living room floor, was the sketchy hallway dude from earlier that night. He had been stabbed multiple times in the torso area from what I could see, with the sheer amount of blood everywhere and the grotesque wound holes. It was honestly amazing he was still alive and breathing at all as we came across the scene. Apparently, some other random person that nobody at the party seemed to be able to identify had gotten into an altercation or dispute with sketchy hallway dude for some unknown reason. In the midst of that, the instigator pulled out a knife and started just brutally stabbing the guy over and over in a frenzied stabbing spree. Just some mindless, horrific act of violence by an unhinged maniac. While the rest of us were just having typical drunken college kid fun, two complete strangers that didn't belong at our party somehow crossed paths inside our place, and one ended up stabbing the other repeatedly. All amid the chaos of the rager, where clearly anyone and everyone was able to wander in unchecked. The cops and paramedics showed up pretty quickly, but definitely not quickly enough. By the time they arrived on the scene, the stabbing victim, who we would later learn was some 32-year-old drifter just looking for somewhere to score free drinks, had lost so much blood from the deep lacerations. The paramedics tried their best, but soon after rushing him away in the ambulance, we found out he ended up dying at the hospital from the blood loss and severity of the wounds. So now we had an actual literal homicide take place inside of our shitty rental home, during a standard Friday night party no less. I'm pretty sure we all aged several years in sheer stress and panic over the course of the following hours. The police kicked into high gear, immediately rounding people up and taking statements while desperately trying to identify any and all individuals involved in the altercation. Me and my roommates all got grilled for what felt like forever, but we obviously knew nothing useful beyond the fact that there was some guy we'd never seen before who got stabbed by another guy we'd never seen before. We were useless as witnesses. As sloppy drunk over-servers of alcohol to minors, we could have landed in huge legal trouble ourselves. Fortunately, I think the cops realized pretty quickly that we were just a bunch of idiot kids who never foresaw someone getting murdered as a possible consequence of our rager. We ended up avoiding any serious charges besides some relatively minor citations. Considering the wild circumstances, I'd say we got extremely lucky there. For the next several months, the police conducted a full-scale homicide investigation and was issuing pleas to the public for any information that could help identify the killer or determine a motive. But it was all to no avail. They eventually hit a dead end and ran out of clues, with zero suspects ever being named or coming forward. In the end, they never caught the killer. No suspects, no motives, no closure or justice for the victim's family. Just some nameless and faceless psycho that happened to show up at our out-of-control college party, get into a random altercation with another random person there, and brutally murder them in the midst of a crowd of witnesses, too drunk to be of any help. Then he was gone, slipped out into the night undetected before anyone even realized at first what exactly had occurred. No signs of him after that night, no trail to follow, as if it was all just a random act of senseless evil that came and went in a blink. A ghost. I'll never forget the visceral image of that poor victim's body, lying face down in our living room, surrounded by spilled drinks and oblivious partygoers having no clue they were stumbling around the scene of a horrific stabbing. A dark crimson pool formed by the blood seeping from multiple gashes all over his abdomen, the paramedics shouting furiously as they tried in vain to stop the bleeding and save his life right there on our cheap, stained carpet. But there was just so goddamn much blood. It soaked into the fibers of that ratty old carpet, leaving a huge dark stain that we could never get out no matter how hard we tried scrubbing and treating it in the aftermath. It was there as an ever-present visceral reminder of the horror that had unfolded in our home every time someone walked through that living room. We ended up just ripping out that whole section of the living room floor and replacing it when we moved out at the end of the year. But even after we got rid of the physical reminder, the mental images never went away. After what I saw that night, it would be a long time before I could ever get the sight of that lifeless body out of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes to sleep, I could see the dead guy's face looking back at me, could see the vacant, glossed-over expression and all the blood surrounding him, could see glimpses of that deranged psycho killer still dressed in his creepy outfit, hovering above the body and plunging the knife over and over, until he was sure his grisly work was completed and his victim was finished off. The sounds of the panicked screams and shouting that suddenly drowned out the party music as the first witnesses came across the scene. No matter how hard I tried to move on and accept it all as just being a random, unpredictable act of violence, the messed up shit still lingered in my mind far too vividly. It ate away at me for months and months after that horrible night, as the investigation played out with no answers or resolution. Whenever I went back to that rental house afterward, I felt like I could still see faint outlines of where the bloodstain used to be, even after it was replaced. Part of me wondered if anyone would ever really be comfortable living in that house again long-term after what transpired there. After that party, I could never again go back to that naive state of thinking everywhere was inherently safe and nothing that bad could ever happen around me. Because now I know firsthand that real evil exists in this world. It can reveal itself at any time, through anyone, literally in your own home or community when you least suspect it. The most mundane, routine settings where you let your guard down are often where the true monsters and sickos end up materializing, ready to pounce. So yeah, be careful out there. And don't take your normal, comfortable life for granted. Appreciate the periods of peace when you have them, because you really never know when your own night could turn into an utter, inescapable horror show, like the one that will be seared into my brain forever. Stay alert, stay safe, and always keep watching for warning signs of potential sudden violence. No matter how chill the vibes might seem on the surface, otherwise you could end up like that unfortunate bastard, killed for no reason at what was supposed to be just another fun weekend get-together to blow off some steam. That's the sad reality we live in sometimes, as ugly and messed up as it may be. I've been working as a food delivery driver for a couple of years now, and I've had my fair share of strange encounters, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was a Friday evening, around 9 p.m., and I had just picked up an order from a popular burger joint downtown. The delivery address was in a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, an area I wasn't too familiar with. As I approached the street, I noticed it was dimly lit, and the houses were spaced far apart, giving it an eerie, isolated vibe. When I reached the address, I was surprised to find it was an old, rundown house that looked abandoned. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the porch light was flickering. I double-checked the address and decided to ring the doorbell just in case. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and a man in his late 30s stood before me. He had a disheveled appearance with unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. There was something unsettling about his demeanor, but I tried to brush it off as just a rough day. "Hey man, I've got your order here," I said, holding up the bag of food. The man stared at me blankly for a few seconds before reaching out to take the bag. As he did, I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. "Thanks," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I was about to ask for the payment when he suddenly turned and disappeared back into the house, leaving the door wide open. Feeling uneasy, I decided to call out to him. "Sir, you haven't paid yet." There was no response, so I took a deep breath and stepped inside the house. The interior was even worse than the outside. The walls were cracked, and the floorboards creaked with every step. The air was thick with a musty, unpleasant odor that made me want to gag. "Hello, sir? I need to get paid for the delivery," I called out, my voice echoing through the empty rooms. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound coming from the back of the house. It sounded like someone crying or whimpering. My heart started racing, and a sense of dread washed over me. I followed the sound down a dimly lit hallway, trying to ignore the overwhelming feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I approached the end of the hall, I noticed a door slightly ajar, and the sound was coming from behind it. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open, and what I saw next will be seared into my memory forever. The room was small and cramped, with no windows and barely any furniture. In the center of the room, tied to a chair, was a young woman. Her face was bruised and swollen, and she had duct tape covering her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror as she looked up at me. In that split second, I knew I had stumbled upon a hostage situation, and my life was in grave danger. Without hesitating, I turned and ran as fast as I could towards the front door. "Hey, stop!" I heard the man's voice shouting from behind me. I didn't look back. I burst through the front door and kept running, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the man's footsteps behind me, growing closer and closer. Suddenly, something whizzed past my head, narrowly missing me. The man had thrown an object, likely trying to stop me from escaping. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys as I desperately tried to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sped away from that nightmare of a house. My hands were shaking violently as I drove, but I knew I had to call the police immediately. I pulled over at a gas station and dialed 911, relaying everything I had seen and heard. Within minutes, police officers arrived at the scene, and a tense standoff ensued. After what felt like hours, the man finally surrendered and was taken into custody. The woman was rescued, and it was later revealed that the man was her former boyfriend who had kidnapped her after she tried to leave him. He had been holding her captive for days, subjecting her to unspeakable torment. As for me, I was incredibly fortunate to have escaped unharmed. The experience left me shaken to my core, and I struggled with the trauma for a long time afterward. I eventually quit my job as a delivery driver, unable to shake the feeling of unease every time I approached an unfamiliar address. To this day, I can still vividly recall the image of that terrified woman, bound and helpless in that dark room. It's a haunting reminder of the evil that can lurk behind even the most unassuming facades, and how quickly an ordinary night can take a turn into a nightmare. This is a story that happened to me last year, when I was working as a food delivery driver for one of those apps. I'm not going to say which one because I don't want them coming after me or anything. Anyway, one night I got an order to deliver to this house way out in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking like 20 minutes outside of town down these empty back roads. The instructions said to call when I arrived since the house was so far off the main road. So I followed the GPS, and it took me down this long, dark driveway through the woods to this big house sitting all alone. I pulled up and called the number like the instructions said. Some guy answered and just grunted, "Yeah," in this gravelly voice. I told him I was there with his food delivery. He said, "Come on up," and hung up. No other instructions, just that. I got out and grabbed the food from my warm bag. As I walked up to the front door, I noticed that despite the huge size of the house, there weren't any lights on except for one dim light coming through a window on the side. Strange for someone having food delivered to have their place so dark. I knocked on the big wooden front door a few times, but there was no answer. I could start to hear some muffled noises from inside though, like someone moving around. So I knocked again, louder. "Hello? Food delivery," I shouted. Suddenly, the door swung open and this massive guy was standing there squinting out at me. He was easily over 6 feet tall and had to weigh 300 pounds, all muscle. Kinda looked like one of those biker dudes with long graying hair and a big bushy beard. But the weird thing was he had these intense, wild-looking eyes that seemed too big for his head. He was just wearing a stained wife-beater shirt and dirty sweatpants. "You got my food?" he growled in this raspy voice. Yeah," I stammered, handing him the bag of containers. "That'll be $24.50. He just stared at me for an uncomfortably long time, not saying anything or moving to pay me. I started to get a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. The total is $24.50, sir," I said again, trying to stay calm and polite. That seemed to snap him out of his daze. "Oh, right, hang on." He disappeared back inside, leaving the door wide open. From where I was standing on the step, I could see into what looked like a big living room area. It was really dark, except for some flickering lights coming from an old tube TV sitting on the floor. The place was also a total mess. There were beer cans, food containers, and random junk just scattered everywhere. The guy came lumbering back a few moments later, still not saying anything. He roughly shoved some cash into my hand, not even counting it out or anything. Thanks," I said, quickly counting it to make sure it was enough. "You have a good night." I tried to hand him back the change, but he just grunted and waved me off, so I pocketed it and turned to leave. That's when I noticed another muffled sound coming from somewhere back inside the house. It almost sounded like a whimpering. That's when I felt another chill go down my spine. Just as I reached my car, I heard the guy say "hey" from behind me in that gravelly voice. I froze in my tracks, not wanting to turn around, but knowing I had to. "Yeah," I called back over my shoulder as calmly as I could. "You allergic to dogs?" No, sir, no allergies," I replied, now feeling really confused in addition to creeped out. "Good, be careful driving home." With that, he slammed the front door shut with a heavy thud, leaving me standing there alone in the dark. I hauled ass out of there as fast as I could, tires kicking up dirt and gravel behind me. All the way driving back into town, I kept replaying that whole encounter over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. The more I thought about it, the more it really started to freak me out. Why was that place such a mess? Why was he being so weird and hostile? And who was that whimpering noise coming from back inside? It started to really eat away at me over the next few days. The more I thought about his final comments about having a dog and driving home carefully, the darker my mind wandered. I started to get the terrible image that maybe he did something to someone and was warning me about his dog in case it attacked me or something. I tried to force it out of my mind, telling myself I was just being paranoid and letting my imagination run wild. But it kept gnawing away at me until I finally broke down and told a friend about the whole experience while we were out at a bar one night. My friend is the type who's always watching those true crime shows, so he was instantly intrigued and convinced me to report it to the police. He kept saying things like, "What if there's someone being held hostage there?" Or, "What if there's a body stashed in that house?" And as crazy as it sounds, it really started to weigh on my mind to the point where I felt I had to let the cops know, just in case. I went down to the station the next day and gave them the details, the address, a description of the guy, how it was all just a gut feeling, but his behavior really set off alarm bells for me. To their credit, the officers actually took me seriously. They said they'd log it and do a drive-by of the property, just to check things out and be sure everything looked okay from the outside. A couple days passed and I tried to just go about my regular routine, putting the whole thing out of my head, until I got a call from one of the officers I'd spoken to. He said that when they went by the property, they immediately noticed something really suspicious. A pair of human foot tracks in the mud leading up to an old, run-down barn way behind the main house. Upon further inspection, they found disturbing signs of some kind of struggle back there, including blood smeared on the walls and what looked like drag marks across the dirt floor. They immediately went and got a search warrant. What they uncovered when they finally searched the entire property was even worse than any of us could have imagined. I don't want to go into too many of the gory details, but from what the police told me, that place was basically a psychopath's playhouse. There was a whole other house hidden way back in the woods that he'd turned into his own private torture chamber. They found all kinds of sick instruments of torture and restraint devices, and remains, dozens of bodies at different stages of decay, some appearing to have been kept alive for God knows how long based on the state they were in. Turns out this guy had been snatching people, primarily loners and runaways that no one would miss right away, and bringing them back to his place for, well, you can imagine the kind of unspeakable twisted games that kind of psycho would put them through. The cops said it was one of the most depraved, nightmare-inducing cases of serial murder they had ever seen. They nicknamed the guy the Butcher because of how barbarically mutilated most of the bodies were. I'll never be able to shake the image of that house in my mind, or the thought that if I just minded my own business and didn't listen to my gut feeling, he would have kept doing what he was doing to who knows how many more innocent people. The worst part is wondering if that whimpering sound was actually coming from some poor soul he had imprisoned and was keeping alive for his sick torture games. It makes me sick to my stomach just thinking about it. I still have nightmares about showing up to deliver that food order and opening the door to a whole room of people trapped in cages or strung up on racks, screaming for help. Anyway, that's my scary true story about working a food delivery job. I quit that same day and took a nice, safe office job afterwards. Some scars you just can't unsee, though. Getting that What to Do About Your Inner Nightmare self-help book for my next birthday. This happened to me a few weeks ago and I'm still kind of freaked out by it. I do food delivery for one of the apps, picking up orders from restaurants and dropping them off at people's houses. It's an okay gig. The money isn't great, but the hours are flexible. Anyways, I got this order around 8 p.m. to pick up from a burger place and deliver to a house on the other side of town. Not too far, maybe a 15-20 minute drive. I get to the burger place, pick up the food, and put the address into my GPS. It was taking me into one of the newer housing developments on the outskirts of the city, one of those areas where all the houses look brand new. I pull up to the address and it's a decent-sized 2-story house at the end of a cul-de-sac. Lots of lights on inside, which is good because I hate when people order food and don't have any exterior lights on. Makes it hard to find the place at night. There were no cars in the driveway or on the street, but I figure they're probably just all parked in the garage. I grab the food and head up to the front door, ringing the doorbell. After a minute of no answer, I ring it again. Still nothing. I'm about to knock when I hear some muffled thumping sounds coming from inside. Okay, cool. I think somebody's coming to the door. The thumping gets a little louder, like somebody stomping around inside toward the entryway. Then this blood-curdling scream suddenly rips through the door, a woman screaming at the top of her lungs like she's being murdered. I damn near dropped the food right there. My heart was pounding out of my chest. The screaming doesn't stop, just goes on and on and on in this horrific wail. My first thought was that I needed to get out of there. Every instinct was telling me to just book it back to my car and drive away as fast as possible. But then I think, what if somebody really does need help in there? What if some lunatic is attacking or killing someone? I shouldn't just run away. I should call the cops at least. So I'm standing there frozen on the doorstep, completely paralyzed, looking around for somewhere to take cover in case a window busts open or a door flies open and whatever's going on inside comes pouring out. But the screaming just keeps going on in this continuous loop, never stopping for a breath and never breaking. Just this insane primal shriek. That's when I start noticing something off about it. It almost sounds artificial or like it's being played through a speaker. There's no variation, no gasping for air in between, just this robotic, endless wail. That's also when I realize there are no other sounds. No furniture being knocked over, no human-sounding grunts of struggle, nothing. At this point, the screaming is still just as loud and steady as when it started. It was pretty clear that either this screaming woman was a robot, or this whole thing was some kind of weird recording or prank being played through the house's surround sound system or something. I figure the only way I'm going to find out what the heck is going on is to try knocking on the door instead of just ringing the bell. So I set the food down, take a couple steps back for safety, then pound as hard as I can on the front door yelling, "Hello? Can anybody hear me?" As soon as I do that, the screaming cuts off like somebody flipped a switch. Dead silence. I stand there for a few seconds, utterly confused. Then from somewhere inside I hear a dude's voice, kind of low and monotone, say, "Oh, sorry man, let me get that for you." More weird artificial sounding thumping noises like footstep sound effects, and then the door swings open. This scrawny guy is standing there, early 20s probably, wearing a greasy bathrobe and slippers. He takes one look at me, frozen in fear on his porch, and bursts out laughing. This really unsettling, wheezing cackle. "Oh man, did my lil sound system get you good?" He chuckles again, then proceeds to grab the food from me without another word. Not even a thank you, and shuts the door in my face. I still don't even know what to make of the whole thing. Was it an audio prank? Some kind of disturbing sound experiment? I thought about calling the cops to check on the guy, but he seemed lucid enough, and I was so eager to get out of there I didn't even consider it at the time. Just hopped in my car and peeled out as fast as I could. Looking back, the whole thing was equal parts terrifying and deeply, deeply unsettling. The newfound realization of how easily a person could use sound effects to make you think somebody was being assaulted or murdered was bad enough. But something about the way that guy answered the door, that dead-eyed look and weird maniacal cackle when he saw I was shaken up, it's haunted me ever since. I never delivered to that house again, and I sure as hell never will. It's a good reminder of all the freaks and weirdos that are out there, I guess. People with some serious issues that you never want to cross paths with. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, but I can't help but feel I narrowly avoided getting mixed up with one of those disturbed individuals. And for that, I'm grateful.